The year is 90 AD. The air in Rome is not filled with the usual roar of the forum or the cries of vendors. It is thick with a different kind of noise, a collective, terrified silence. The city holds its breath. A procession moves through the streets, but it is not a triumph. There are no cheering crowds, no soldiers laden with spoils. There are only the grim faces of the city's priests, the pontifices, and the silent, armed lictors, their faces set like stone. They are escorting a lectica, a litter, but it is completely sealed, muffled in black cloth. Inside, a woman sits in total darkness. She is not a foreign captive. She is not a common criminal. She is, until this very morning, the single most sacred and powerful woman in the Roman Empire. Her name is Cornelia, and she is the Vestalis Maxima, the chief Vestal Virgin. She is not being taken to the Capitoline Hill to be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock. She is not being taken to the Tullium, the state prison, to be strangled. The procession passes the city walls, heading for a place just outside the Colline Gate, a place the Romans whisper about, a place they call the Campus Scaleratus, the field of wickedness. When the litter stops, the priests will open it. Cornelia will be led to a small staircase descending into the earth. At the bottom is a tiny, freshly dug chamber. Inside, the priests have placed a small bed, a lighted lamp, a single loaf of bread, a flask of water, a little milk, and a little oil. Cornelia will be forced down the stairs. The priests will not strike her. They will not shed her blood. They will simply seal the entrance, piling earth and stone over the opening until the staircase, the chamber, and the woman inside are gone forever. They are burying her alive. She is a Vestal Virgin. Her purity is the divine insurance policy for the survival of Rome itself, and she has just been found guilty of breaking her vow. How did it come to this? How could a society that built the Colosseum and invented modern law cling to a ritual of such profound, cold-blooded barbarism? How could women who were revered as living goddesses, who held more power and freedom than any other woman in the empire, be subjected to the most horrific death imaginable? The story of the Vestal Virgins is not just a story of faith. It is a story of politics and the terrifying razor-thin line between privilege and peril. The question isn't just whether Cornelia was guilty. The question is why this punishment, this living tomb, was the only answer. What you are about to hear is not the history you were taught in school. This is the story that Rome itself tried to bury. To understand how a Vestal Virgin could be buried alive, you must first understand why she was, for over 1,000 years, the most important person in Rome. More important in many ways than the consuls, the senators, or even the emperors themselves. They were not, as we might imagine them, simply nuns. That is a Christian concept. A concept of withdrawal from the world. The Vestals were the absolute opposite. They were pillars of the Roman state, deeply, profoundly embedded in its political and spiritual machinery. They were, quite literally, the keepers of Rome's fate. Their order was ancient, predating the Roman Republic, even predating the city of Rome itself. Legend, as told by Roman historians like Livy and Plutarch, claims the order was founded by Rome's second king, the philosopher king Numa Pompilius. He built a temple to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, the home, and the family. But Vesta was not just a goddess of a home. She was the goddess of Rome's home. Her temple was not a grand, sprawling complex like the Temple of Jupiter. It was a modest, circular building in the very heart of the Forum. It was designed to look like a simple, archaic, round shepherd's hut. And inside, there was no statue of the goddess. There was only a flame. This was the ignis inextinctus, the sacred eternal flame of Vesta. This fire was the heartbeat of Rome. As long as it burned, Rome would stand. If it ever went out, the city would fall. It was that simple. But the flame was not the only thing they guarded. Deep within the temple, in a sealed underground sanctum called the Penis Vestae, were the Pignora Imperii, the pledges of empire. These were a collection of sacred objects, relics so powerful that the fate of Rome was believed to be magically tied to their survival. What were they? No one knows for sure. It was the state's most closely guarded secret. Roman writers speculated that one of them was the Palladium, the ancient statue of Athena that Aeneas himself had supposedly rescued from the burning ruins of Troy and brought to Italy. To guard these two things, the living flame and the secret relics, Numa created a college of priestesses. 4 at first, then 6. These women would be dedicated to 30 years of state service, and during that time, they would be bound by one terrifying, non-negotiable vow: chastity. Why virginity? Because Vesta herself was a virgin goddess. The purity of her priestesses was a magical mirror, reflecting and guaranteeing the purity and integrity of the Roman state. Their virginity was not a personal choice. It was a state-level magical shield. Here on Crimson Historians, we dig into the archives the world forgot. We pull voices from the darkness. And the story of the Vestals is one that echoes from the deepest, most hidden chambers of history. This is the central paradox of the Vestal Virgins. They were simultaneously the most privileged and the most endangered women in the ancient world. Their sacred status gave them power that emperors might envy. But that same sacred status made them the ultimate scapegoat. When Rome was strong, they were revered. But when Rome was afraid, when the crops failed, when plague stalked the streets, when the legions were slaughtered on a distant frontier, the terrified eyes of the entire city turned to one place: the house of Vesta. The gods were angry, and it had to be someone's fault. But before we can understand the tomb, we must first understand the palace. The life of a Vestal Virgin began not with a choice, but with an act of capture. The selection process was called the captio. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, would personally select a girl from a noble, patrician family. The requirements were rigid. She had to be between 6 and 10 years old, physically perfect, with both parents still living. The historian Aulus Gellius preserves the ancient, chilling formula. The Pontifex Maximus would find the girl, take her by the hand, and pronounce the words, "Amata, I take you to be a priestess of Vesta, who will perform the sacred rites that it is the law for a Vestal priestess to perform on behalf of the Roman people. Thus you are as she who was taken, O beloved." The word he used, capio, is the same root word as captive. She was, in a very real legal sense, seized by the state. From that moment, she no longer belonged to her father. She belonged to Vesta. This was, on its face, a terrifying prospect. A 6-year-old girl removed from her family, her hair cut, dressed in the archaic white robes of the order, and bound to 30 years of service. But what she received in return was, for a woman in the ancient world, almost unbelievable. The first thing she gained was freedom. Every other woman in Rome, from the empress down to the poorest plebeian, lived her entire life under the legal control of a man. This was the patria potestas, the power of the father. A woman was passed from her father's legal control to her husband's. She could not, in most cases, own property, sign a contract, or write a will without her male guardian's permission. The Vestal Virgin was exempt from all of it. The moment she entered the order, she became sui juris, of her own law. She was her own legal person. She could inherit her family's wealth, own vast estates, manage her own finances, write her own will, and testify in a court of law without taking an oath, because her word was considered inherently sacred. This legal and financial independence made the six Vestals fabulously wealthy and influential. They were major players in the Roman economy, landlords and patrons, and their social power was even greater. When a Vestal Virgin walked in public, she was preceded by a lictor, a state bodyguard who carried the fasces, the bundle of rods that symbolized the state's power to punish. This was an honor typically reserved for the highest magistrates, like consuls. Everyone, regardless of rank, was required to yield the right of way to her. To obstruct a Vestal's path was a serious crime. If she, by chance, happened to cross paths with a criminal being led to execution, that prisoner was immediately and automatically pardoned, freed on the spot. Her mere presence had the power to override the state's judgment. At the Colosseum, while other women were relegated to the nosebleed seats in the highest tiers, the Vestals had a place of honor. They sat in a special box directly opposite the emperor, on the same level as the senators. Their home, the Atrium Vestae, the House of Vesta, was not a humble convent. It was a palace. Located right in the Roman Forum, it was a sprawling, 3-story, 50-room complex built around a stunning central courtyard. It had its own private baths, kitchens, shrines, and luxurious apartments, all heated by a sophisticated underfloor system. It was staffed by dozens of slaves and servants, all dedicated to the comfort of these 6 women. Their political power was immense, though subtle. Because they were seen as incorruptible and sacrosanct, the Vestals became the trusted guardians of Rome's most important documents. Julius Caesar, Augustus, Mark Antony, they all entrusted their last wills and testaments to the Vestals for safekeeping. To steal from the Temple of Vesta was not just theft, it was a sacrilege that would doom the perpetrator, so the documents were safe. This also meant the Vestals knew everyone's secrets. They were the confidants of emperors and the arbitrators of family disputes. A letter of recommendation from the Vestalis Maxima could secure a military command or a political office. For 30 years they lived this life of incredible privilege. The term was divided into 3 decades. For the first 10 years, she was a novice, learning the complex ancient rituals. For the second 10 years, she was a serving Vestal, performing the rites and guarding the flame. For the final 10 years, she was a mistress, teaching the new novices. After 30 years, at the age of 36 or 40, she was free to leave. She was given a generous state pension and was, for the first time, legally allowed to marry. Most, however, chose not to. Plutarch notes that the few who did marry often met with unhappy or disastrous ends, which was taken as a bad omen. But the truth is likely more practical. After 30 years of being the most powerful, independent, and wealthy women in Rome, answerable to no man, why would she suddenly choose to step down, get married, and place herself back under the legal control of a husband? She lived in a golden cage. She was a living symbol, a public treasure, a stateswoman and a priestess. But the bars of that cage were forged from a single, terrifying element, and the price for bending them was absolute. The power of the Vestals was built on a single sacred transaction. Rome gave them everything. In return, they gave Rome their virginity. This was the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. It was the central contract of Roman religion. The Romans believed the gods were powerful, pragmatic, and easily offended. If you performed the correct rituals at the correct time, in the correct way, the gods would favor Rome. If you failed, they would unleash their wrath. The Vestals were the front line of this spiritual defense. The crime of a Vestal breaking her vow was called incestum. This word does not mean what we think it means. It didn't just mean unchaste, it meant incest. Why? Because Vesta was the symbolic mother of the Roman family, familia. Her priestesses were her ritual daughters. For a Vestal to have a sexual relationship, she was committing a symbolic act of incest against the entire Roman state. She wasn't just breaking a personal promise, she was committing high treason. She was polluting the familia, poisoning the spiritual well from which all of Rome drank. An act of incestum was a nephos, an unspeakable act that ripped a hole in the fabric of the Pax Deorum. It invited plague, it guaranteed famine, it doomed the legions to defeat. It was, quite simply, the most terrifying crime a Roman could imagine. And so, the life of a Vestal was one of endless, meticulous, and stressful ritual. Their primary duty was, of course, the flame. It could never go out. The Vestals worked in shifts, day and night, 365 days a year, watching it. If a Vestal was on duty and fell asleep, or was negligent, and the flame wavered and died, the city would panic. The punishment was immediate and brutal. The Pontifex Maximus would be summoned. The negligent Vestal would be taken to a dark, windowless room. She would be stripped of her robes, and the chief priest would take a leather scourge and beat her, savagely, in the pitch black. The darkness was symbolic, the darkness she had brought upon Rome by extinguishing the light. After the beating, she would have to rekindle the flame, but she could not use flint and tinder. She had to use an archaic, difficult method, rubbing two sticks together, or using a lens to focus the sun's rays. It was a humiliating, painful process, a public reminder of her failure. This was the lesser crime. Their other duties were just as precise. They could not drink water from Rome's public aqueducts. It was considered polluted by the masses. They had to walk every single day to the sacred spring of the nymph Egeria outside the city walls and carry the pure water back in special clay vessels called fictilia. They were the ritual bakers for the state. They prepared the mola salsa, a coarse, salted flour. This mixture was sprinkled on the heads of every animal sacrificed at Rome's major festivals. Without the mola salsa prepared by the Vestals' pure hands, no sacrifice was valid. They were constant participants in Rome's endless calendar of religious festivals. The Vestalia in June, where they opened their temple to the women of Rome. The Lupercalia in February, a wild, strange fertility ritual. The Fordicidia in April, where they sacrificed a pregnant cow. Every day was a performance of purity. Every action was scrutinized, and this created the perfect weapon for their enemies. This is the core of the Vestal's tragedy, the scapegoat mechanism. Because their purity was magically linked to Rome's success, their impurity was the default explanation for Rome's failures. Did a Roman general lose a catastrophic battle like the one at Cannae against Hannibal? The gods must be angry. The Vestals were immediately investigated for incestum. In that specific case, 2 Vestals were in fact condemned and buried alive. Did a plague sweep through the city's crowded slums? The gods are clearly displeased. Find the Vestal who has broken her vow. Did a fire rage through the forum? It must be a sign of divine anger. The Vestals are to blame. The Vestal Virgins were the spiritual lightning rods for the entire state. They absorbed all of its anxiety, all of its fear, and all of its guilt. When a disaster struck, it was never the fault of a bad general, a corrupt politician, or simple bad luck. It was always a spiritual failure. And the easiest, most convenient, and most dramatic way to fix the problem, to appease the gods and show the populace that the state was taking action, was to find a polluted Vestal, offer her to the underworld, and cleanse the city. For a politician, it was the perfect tool. Want to destroy a rival senator? Accuse him of having an affair with a Vestal. He would be scourged to death, and his entire family would be disgraced. Want to seize the vast estates of a wealthy Vestal? Accuse her of incestum. Want to distract a terrified and angry population from your own military or economic failures? Stage a grand, horrifying public spectacle and purify the state by burying a Vestal Virgin. Their holiness was their only shield, but it was also the very weapon that would be used against them. For most of Rome's 1,100-year history, the Vestals performed their duties in silence and security. The system worked, but the pages of Roman history are stained with moments of profound crisis. And in these moments, the Atrium Vestae became the epicenter of the state's terror. The trials of the Vestals were not trials in any modern sense. There was no jury, no beyond a reasonable doubt. The accuser was often the Pontifex Maximus himself, acting on rumor, omen, or, most often, political calculation. The Vestal was interrogated, often under torture. This too required a legal loophole. A Vestal, as a sacred citizen, could not be tortured. So they would transfer her ownership from the goddess Vesta to the Pontifex Maximus personally, making her his slave for the duration of the interrogation. Then they could legally torture her. Let's look at the evidence. Case Study 1, Oppia, 483 BCE. We travel back to the early Republic, a young, fragile city-state struggling against its neighbors. The historian Livy tells us it was a time of dread. The Volscian and Veientine tribes were threatening Rome. A series of terrible omens, or prodigia, were reported. The gods were angry. A cause had to be found. The gaze of the priests fell upon the Vestal Virgin Oppia. She was accused of incestum. Livy provides no details of her trial, no evidence, no named lover. He simply states the brutal fact: the Vestal Oppia, being found guilty of unchastity, was punished. This meant she was taken to the Campus Sceleratus and buried alive. What was her real crime? We will never know. But her death served a purpose. It was a ritual cleansing, a human sacrifice designed to appease the gods and restore the state's confidence. Oppia was, almost certainly, Rome's first recorded scapegoat. Case Study 2, The Great Scandal of 114 BCE. This was different. This wasn't a single accusation. It was a firestorm that threatened to burn down the entire order. The Republic was in a deep moral and political crisis. The historian Cassius Dio describes a state plagued by many portents. A bolt of lightning struck the temple of Juno. The city was on edge. Then, the accusation. Emilia, one of the 6 Vestals, had been seduced by a Roman knight, Lucius Veturius. The investigation began, and it unraveled a network of corruption. Emilia, it was claimed, had not just broken her vow, she had then acted as a procuress, helping her lover and his friends seduce 2 other Vestals, Licinia and Marcia. The city was thrown into a panic. Half of the Vestal College was corrupt. The sacred flame itself was being tended by polluted hands. This was a spiritual catastrophe. The Pontifex Maximus at the time, Lucius Caecilius Metellus, conducted the initial trial. He convicted Emilia, the ringleader, and sentenced her to death. But, perhaps for political reasons, he acquitted Licinia and Marcia. The Roman people were outraged. They saw a cover-up. This wasn't enough to satisfy the angry gods. A tribune of the plebes, Sextus Peducaeus, took the extraordinary step of bypassing the priests and creating a special commission to retry the case. This new trial was a brutal political purge. It wasn't just about the Vestals, it was about their lovers. Licinia and Marcia were retried, found guilty, and buried alive. Their alleged lovers and others implicated in the scandal were hunted down, tried, and scourged to death in the Forum. It was a bloodbath, a moral panic designed to cleanse a republic that felt it was rotting from within. 3 Vestals were dead. A generation of young nobles were executed. The Pax Deorum was supposedly restored. Case Study 3. Licinia and Crassus, 73 BCE. Sometimes the scandal wasn't driven by moral panic, but by something far more Roman: greed. We know this story from Plutarch. The Vestal in question was another Licinia. The man accused was none other than Marcus Licinius Crassus, the future triumvir, the man who would defeat Spartacus, and the wealthiest man in Rome. Crassus was a notorious real estate speculator. He famously said that no man was rich who could not support an army from his own reserves. He bought up property all over Rome, especially distressed properties from families in debt or from the proscription lists of the dictator Sulla. He was seen visiting the Vestal Licinia's house a lot. Rumors began to fly. Crassus, the most powerful man in Rome, was committing incestum with a Vestal. An accuser, Plotius, brought the case to trial. The punishment for Crassus would be death by scourging. For Licinia, the living tomb. The trial was a sensation, but Crassus had a defense, and it was one of pure, shameless cynicism. He stood before the judges and admitted he had been visiting Licinia constantly. He had been flattering her and spending time with her, but not for sex. He was trying to buy her villa. Licinia owned a magnificent property in the suburbs that Crassus coveted. He had been courting her, he claimed, only to wear down her resistance and get her to sell it to him at a bargain price. The judges, Roman oligarchs who understood the pull of a good real estate deal, found this defense entirely plausible. Plutarch writes, "It was his avarice that cleared him of the charge, and he was acquitted. But he did not let Licinia go until he had acquired her property." Licinia was saved. Her reputation was in tatters, but she was alive. Crassus got his land. The case is a stunning example of how the sacred vow of the Vestals had become just another political and financial tool for the Roman elite. But all these cases, Oppia's sacrifice, Emilia's corruption, Licinia's real estate deal, pale in comparison to the calculated cruelty of an emperor. Case Study 4. The Terror of Domitian, 90 SCN. This is the story we began with, the story of Cornelia. The Emperor Domitian was a tyrant. He was paranoid, cruel, and obsessed with his own divine image. He demanded to be called Dominus et Deus, Master and God. He was also a self-styled moral crusader, publicly executing senators for immorality while engaging in his own depraved affairs. He hated the Senate, and he hated any power that did not flow directly from himself. And the ancient, independent, and revered power of the Vestal Virgins was a threat. In 83 AD, Domitian accused 3 Vestals of incestum, but perhaps feeling merciful, he allowed them to choose their own manner of death. They all committed suicide. Their lovers were exiled. This was not enough. In 90 AD, Domitian decided to make a statement the city would never forget. He revived the ancient, terrifying law of live burial, which had not been used in generations. His target? Cornelia, the Vestalis Maxima herself, the chief Vestal. The historian Pliny the Younger, an eyewitness to the events, describes the episode in a letter, his words burning with contempt and horror. He calls it a crime. Cornelia was accused of incestum with a knight named Celer. Pliny is clear, the trial was a sham. Domitian acted as both prosecutor and judge. He wasn't in the courtroom, he was in his palace, receiving reports and issuing decrees. Cornelia, unlike the others, did not commit suicide. She maintained her innocence to the very end. Pliny describes her final moments with heartbreaking clarity. As she was being led to her execution, she was manhandled by the priests. Her robes snagged. She turned and adjusted them. When one of the priests offered a hand to help her down the dark staircase, she recoiled, refusing to be polluted by his touch, as if she were, with this last gesture of chastity, repelling her own funeral. Pliny tells us that as she descended into the tomb, she was heard to whisper, "How can the emperor believe me to be unchaste when I have performed the sacred rites by which he himself has won his victories?" It was a devastating final protest. The rituals she performed, the rituals that guaranteed Rome's military success, could only be performed by a pure Vestal. His victories, she was saying, were proof of her innocence. But the logic of a tyrant does not bend. Her alleged lover, the knight Celer, was hunted down. He was taken to the Comitium, the public square, tied to a stake and whipped to death by the public executioner, who was ordered to strike him until his soul departs. Domitian had purified Rome. He had shown the world the price of defying his moral authority. He had taken the most sacred woman in Rome and turned her into a public, horrifying sacrifice. It was, as Pliny the Younger called it, a monstrous spectacle, an act of impiety dressed up as justice, and it reveals the final, terrible truth of the Vestal's vow. It was not a shield, it was a target. So we return to that field of evil, the Campus Scaleratus. We return to the moment the stone is rolled into place and the sound of falling dirt begins. Why this death? Why the elaborate, sadistic theater of the lamp, the bed, and the loaf of bread? The answer is a masterpiece of Roman legal and religious hypocrisy. The person of a Vestal Virgin was sacred, holy, untouchable. Her body belonged to the goddess. To raise a sword against her, To shed her blood was a sacrilege so profound it would doom the man who struck the blow and the city that ordered it. You could not execute a Vestal. But the state needed her dead. So they devised a loophole, a way to kill her without killing her. By sealing her in an underground chamber, they were not shedding her blood. The executioner's hand never touched her. By providing her with food, water, and a lamp, they were not technically starving her to death. They were, in their own twisted logic, simply abandoning her. They were removing her from the world of the living and consigning her to the gods of the underworld. Her death, when it came, from suffocation as the lamp consumed the last of the air, or from thirst days later in the crushing darkness, was a matter between her and the gods. The state's hands were clean. The ritual was precise, designed to absolve everyone of guilt. Plutarch describes it. On the day of her execution, the Pontifex Maximus would first pronounce her polluted. She would be stripped of her vitae, the sacred headbands, and her white robes. She would be dressed in a funeral shroud. She would be bound and gagged, as one writer noted, so that her curses could not be heard, and placed in the sealed litter. The procession was a funeral for a living woman. The entire city was ordered to mourn, to remain silent as she passed. At the Campus Sceleratus, the Pontifex Maximus would raise his hands to the sky. He would utter a long formal prayer, not to Vesta, but to the gods of the underworld. He would declare that he and the Roman people were innocent of this woman's death. He was merely handing over a polluted vessel that was no longer fit for divine service. Then he would unbind her. He would turn his head away, as it was forbidden to look upon the face of a Vestal at the moment of her doom. She would be forced down the steps. The chamber was a hypogeum, a tomb. It was a womb of earth, designed to be her final resting place. The symbolic gifts were the final, cruelest twist. They were the funeral items typically buried with a corpse. They were not for her to live on. They were to prove that she had been given a proper burial. Then the sealing. The priests would walk away. The crowd would disperse in silence. We are left to imagine what happened next in the absolute, total darkness beneath a random field in Rome. We are left to imagine the psychological horror, the slow, creeping cold, the realization that the lamp is consuming the air, the smell of the damp earth, the sound of her own breathing, her own heartbeat, the silence. A silence more profound than any she had ever experienced in the temple. She could scream, but only the earth would hear her. She could pray, but the gods of the heavens seemed very far away. This was the mors in terra, the death in the earth. It was a death designed to erase her, to swallow her identity, to leave no trace, no blood, no memorial. It was the ultimate act of disappearing someone. You are standing at the edge of that dark pit, looking in. This is the reality of power and ritual. If you believe these are the stories that must be told, that history's darkest corners must be illuminated, then I ask you to subscribe to Crimson Historians. Help us continue to dig. Help us give voice to the voiceless. Let me use the ancient ceremonies, for I cannot change. Let me live in my own way, for I am free. This is the religion that tamed the world for me. This is the faith that drove Hannibal from my walls. Grant us only peace for the gods of our fathers. He specifically defended the Vestals, arguing that defunding them would bring famine and ruin. He was answered by the formidable Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. Ambrose's reply was scathing, triumphant and utterly uncompromising. He ridiculed the superstitions. He asked, did the Vestal's purity save Rome from its past defeats? Where were the gods when the Gauls sacked the city centuries ago? He argued that the state's money should go to the Christian poor, not to keep 6 virgins in luxury. Ambrose won. The altar was not restored. The funding for the Vestals was cut off. The final blow came in 391 AD. The Emperor Theodosius I, a fervent Christian, issued the Theodosian decrees. Paganism, in all its forms, was outlawed. Attending a pagan sacrifice was now an act of treason. Theodosius' soldiers marched into the Roman Forum. They entered the Temple of Vesta, and for the first time in 1,100 years, they deliberately and permanently extinguished the sacred flame. The Atrium Vestae was abandoned. The remaining Vestals, we don't know how many, perhaps only a few, were pensioned off and dismissed. The order was dissolved. We know the name of the last Vestalis Maxima. Her name was Caelia Concordia. She saw the end of it all. In a final act of trying to build a bridge to the New World, she even erected a statue to the Christian wife of the general Stilicho. It was no use. Her world was gone. The irony is devastating. For over 1,000 years, the Vestals had been told that if the flame went out, Rome would fall. The flame was extinguished in 391 AD. 19 years later, in 410 AD, the Goth king Alaric and his army stood at the gates of Rome. For the first time in 800 years, the eternal city was breached, invaded, and brutally sacked. The prophecy, in the end, had come true. Today, the Atrium Vestae is a beautiful, haunting ruin. Tourists walk through the central courtyard, past the lily ponds and the broken statues of the chief Vestals. It is a peaceful place, a place of sunlight and broken stone. It is easy to forget what it represents. The Vestal Virgins were not simple victims. They were not just passive pawns. They were complex women who navigated a world of terrifying stakes. They traded a normal life of marriage and children for 30 years of power, wealth, and autonomy that no other woman in their world could even dream of. They were politicians, landowners, stateswomen, and sacred icons. They were also the ultimate scapegoats. They were the living symbols of Rome's purity, and therefore the perfect targets for Rome's fear. History is written by the victors, but memory is carved in the tombs of the forgotten. The story of Oppia, of Aemilia, of Marcia, and of Cornelia is a story that was meant to be erased. It was a story buried in the earth, silenced in the darkness, and written over by the victors. The Roman Empire is gone. The emperors are dust. The Pontifex Maximus is now a title held by the Pope in a different Rome. But the story of these women, the women who were taken, who held the fate of an empire in their hands, and who were sacrificed when that empire felt itself begin to crack, that story remains. It is a timeless, brutal lesson about the nature of power, the danger of fanaticism, and the terrifying price that societies sometimes demand of those they claim to hold sacred. But this leaves us with a question. Who were they? Were the Vestals tragic victims of religious fanaticism? Or were they willing players in a high-stakes game who accepted this terrible risk in exchange for a life of power? We have unearthed the story, but the verdict is yours. Tell us what you think in the comments below. What is the true legacy of the Vestal Virgins? And if you believe more stories like this must be brought out of the darkness, subscribe to Crimson Historians. Help us keep the past alive.